Hello, and thank you all for being here. I really hope you are enjoying the second and final day of this year's Green Coffee Summit. My name is Jen Ruggalo, and I am the Curatorial Director and Editor of the SCA's biannual publication 25. This moment is also a really great opportunity for me to quickly thank the partners whose support allows us to produce these free-to-attend virtual events. In this case, it's our title sponsor, Barista Attitude, and our supporting sponsors, BWT Water & More, Mercanta, and San Coffee Brazil. Our next session, a panel on coffee sourcing and production trends in Europe from 2021 to 2022, will be led by a moderator who may already be familiar to some of you, founder of Radio Lifeline, Peter Kettler, who has been active in the specialty coffee industry for over 25 years with experience in the roasting, retail, trading, and development sectors. Peter's career history includes really interesting and impactful projects like Radio Lifeline, a farmer-focused initiative that created a network of community radio stations to provide farmers with vital information, which Peter founded in 2004, or the Black Earth Project, the first large-scale research into the use of biochar by smallholder coffee farmers, a project Peter launched in 2010. In 2019, Peter joined Fairtrade International as the Global Coffee Manager, and most recently, he has served as the Senior Coffee Advisor to the International Trade Center. And if that last name sounds familiar, it's because they recently released the 4th edition of the Coffee Buyer's Guide, a reference that we spoke about yesterday in a different session, which is another incredible free resource. So if you haven't checked that out, I would also suggest that you do. So now I would really love to welcome Peter. If you want to flip your camera on, we are so excited to have you. I know we are in great hands, so I'm just going to disappear now so you can tell the audience a little bit more about the session, introduce our panelists, and start the discussion. And audience, don't forget to ask your questions in the panel in the chat. I will be in the background helping to get them over to our panel here, but I will reappear very briefly at the end. Peter, it's all yours. Thank you so much for leading us in this session.
Thank you, Jen, and welcome everybody to what I'm sure is going to be a compelling panel discussion where we'll be focusing on some of the key findings of the 2021-22 Algrano Market Trends Review. We'll be looking at the methodology that was used to compile the report, as well as how some of the trends identified in that report continue to evolve today in the face of so many internal and external challenges affecting the coffee industry. And today I'm joined by the CEO of Algrano, as well as a research team that helped to compile the data. So at this point, I'd like to invite each of them to take a moment to introduce themselves. Nora, let's start with you.
Thanks, Peter. Hi, everyone, and thanks for having me. So my name is Nora Burkey. I am the founder and executive director of the Chain Collaborative. We do a lot of things as a nonprofit in the coffee industry, but one of those things is consulting on various assignments. And so in this past year, we had the absolute privilege to be a part of the Market Trends Review for Algrano. So I served alongside Elisa as one of the principal authors and researchers for the report. So I will turn it over to Elisa now.
Thank you, Nora. Thank you, Peter. Thank you for having us. It's really a nice opportunity to be able to share with you some of these trends that we identified. My name is Elisa Christian, and I'm the founder and CEO of Digital Coffee Future. And as Nora mentioned, alongside with her, we collaborated to be able to compile these findings for Algrano. So I will turn it over to Rafael.
Hi, everybody. It's a pleasure to be speaking to you, with you, hopefully later in the session as well. As Peter said, I'm the CEO and one of the 3 co-founders of Algrano. We are connecting since 2015 roasters and coffee growers. We are doing this through an online platform where they can trade together online, and we are supporting them with everything that all the details that happen afterwards in terms of execution, exporting, importing, financing, insurance of the coffee, quality assurance, etc. We're doing so with around 400 roasters in 30 countries and around 200 coffee growers and cooperatives in 20 countries.
Great. Thank you. I'd also like to note that the full bios of our speakers, our panelists, are available on the Green Coffee Summit website, and that you can find links to their individual work and also a copy of the full Algrano report in the chat. So without further ado, I'd like to dig into the report itself. And I'd like to start by asking all of you about how you compiled the report, because it must have been especially challenging given the unprecedented issues that the global pandemic brought to all of us, and the level of uncertainty that it brought to so many different aspects of our lives. I think that many of us found the report really valuable because it created a kind of virtual snapshot of an industry in crisis and how the industry responded to that additional stress. So can you start by telling us how you went about designing the report and the main benefits that you hope to provide to the industry as a whole?
Yeah, I'm happy to give the feed or the background here. So we are doing this report now for the second time, or we did the report for the second time. And the intention behind it is that we see a lot of information about origin countries being shared with coffee roasters. We know how the crop looks like in Colombia. We know whether it rains in Brazil. We in the roasting countries have a lot of information. That's unfortunately not true about the other side. So there's very little information about demand going back to origin. And that's the intention of this report. So to stop this information asymmetry, to provide information back to producers to understand what are consuming trends and where is the market heading. For this report, it was very, as you mentioned, Peter, it was a very interesting environment. The coffee industry was under stress. We had huge prices, and it was very important for us to understand whether this is a normal boom period or whether there are significant changes where roasters and sellers react differently to the boom due to the stresses we saw in the system as the pandemic. And, there were a lot of hypotheses in our heads, and there were, of course, also a lot of things we heard from roasters. And that's why it was for us so important to have somebody independent going independently after some research questions. And that's when we got in touch with Elisa and Nora. And that was really, really, I would say not just luck, but I think their work is incredible. The report exceeded all our expectations, and the benefits. I can maybe tell you a few numbers. They spoke to roasters from 13 countries. They spoke to producers from 15 countries. There were independent industry organizations and etc. involved in the report, and it got extremely deep and hundreds of downloads within 2 weeks. So, the report was translated in Spanish, in Portuguese. Initially, it was written in English, and we saw people posting in forums about the report. And I think, that's the best way to measure the benefits it has. I think there is information in this report that is valuable as well for growers as for roasters. And we saw it really spread very quickly, and I'm very happy because that's also, of course, a big reward for the great work Nora and Elisa did.
Yeah, I'm sure it was a difficult landscape to navigate under any circumstances, but especially under the pandemic. So I'm wondering, what were some of the most critical issues related to producers that you discovered in the process of compiling the report? And then conversely, also, what were those issues most important to roasters?
Thanks for the question, Peter. I know we're going to talk a little bit about how the pandemic maybe exacerbated or played into a lot of these challenges as well a little bit down the line in the webinar. So I'll focus on the critical issues both for producers and roasters right now. And I think for me, the main issue that came up during the research process wasn't actually so much something new, but rather a new take on the same or something that we've been navigating for a while, and that's profitability. So it's obvious that in the past year, one of the factors that the specialty coffee industry had to navigate was, quote unquote, high prices. And I'm putting that in quotes because I think it's important to note that prices are only high in comparison to where they've been in the past, which is consistently low and artificially low, really. So, what was new, and it was in terms of how these prices, I think, were managed in the past year, in the past year and a half, as a result of many other things that were going on. But I think, the kind of fluctuation itself is something consistent. But I'll first talk about how this particular fluctuation, caused issues on the roaster side and then the producers. So in the case of the roasters, at least for those that we spoke to, many said that they struggled to know when the best time to buy coffee was, or when they should lock in contracts. They said they were, in some cases, either waiting for the price to fall sort of at first, and then once they realized it wasn't going to fall, they were kind of waiting to know when was the best time to buy coffee before it would, the price would rise again. And then that related to other issues where it was the low production, which I know we're going to get into, and so it was hard to know if coffee would become available. Many other reasons why it was challenging to know if coffee would become available, and we'll talk about that. But I think in face of all those challenges, what I saw as really unique is that many of the roasters that we talked to were very open about needing to take a hit on profitability themselves. For the most part, they really understood the position that farmers, and especially cooperatives who bought from small scale farmers, were in, and that they were facing challenges in fulfilling their own contracts with other buyers. And I know, as I said, I keep saying we're going to talk about it. Elisa will mention that, what that meant. But for roasters, they understood that they needed to compensate farmers fairly as well, and so they ended up working in partnership with the farmers that they bought from, and in some cases they kind of spent more and they earned less, and this became a bit of a strategy. I will say that we talked to a lot of front runners, right, and we talked to a lot of people in the specialty coffee industry who have really been active and vocal advocates for a while for equity and sustainability. So maybe there was some sort of bias in that answer, but I did find it to be unique. And then on the kind of the farmer side, I think it's important to note too that the sort of hit that maybe the roasters took, and they were spending more, earning less, that didn't also mean increased profitability for farmers either. Most of the farmers and farmer representatives that we spoke to were lamenting the fact that prices for fertilizer, for example, were really high. And this pointed to the fact that kind of everyone was aware that prices for coffee were higher. So input suppliers, locally thought, well, hey, if prices for coffee are higher, then farmers can afford more for their inputs. So there was this increase in local speculation that meant at the end of the day, even if the price of coffee increased, so did cost of production, ergo, declining, or at least, the same level of profitability in best case scenario. So, I think there were a lot of other things that impacted that, and different challenges that of course, that farmers and roasters mentioned. But, that to me was kind of one of the biggest takeaways, and something that I would encourage people to really focus on in the report. And then maybe lastly as well, this issue of financing, because if prices are increasing, then that meant that cooperatives, or especially those who are buying from small scale farmers, they needed increased financing to be able to make their sales. And so in a world where pre-finance is already difficult, rising prices didn't necessarily help matters. Not to say that we shouldn't figure out a way to keep prices high, but it was of course just a challenge. And then lastly, before I turn it over to one of my colleagues, I think the other thing that stood out was that this kind of volatility and the need to manage so many challenges, farmer representatives and farmers themselves are really sort of saying this is a bit like business as usual, in the sense that, yes, there's uniqueness in what's going on, but coffee is never easy, profitability is never easy, and managing prices and local speculation, it's always around us. So I think they felt prepared in a way for it as well. And so, yeah, I think I'll leave it there for now, but can we return to that question a little bit later in terms of, was this really new, what we saw, or more of the same, just in a different way?
Great. Thanks, Nora. Yeah, what's old is new again. Raphael, do you have something to add?
My biggest surprise to it, because I was, or one finding the finding that surprised me most, actually, that is really when I read the report first, and I literally saw it when it looked beautiful, and then that had all the pictures and graphs in it, and there was I was supposing that with problems in the supply chain, so we had a lot of coffees that were late on water, that would not reach roasters at the time. We had prices that were high and growers with other opportunities to sell their coffees with less effort at interesting prices locally. I was supposing that these direct business relationships between roasters and producers will get under pressure, and some will also maybe stop. And that's not what the report found. So 50% of the roasters, that were interviewed, and that's also important. So the research team was free to interview wherever roasters. That's not just Algrano customers, right? They were answering that direct business relationships or direct trade is important for them. And 2/3 of the producers and the roasters interviewed mentioned that they will invest more in the future to build more of those direct relationships. And I think that was for me really, really surprising to see that they see in the direct relationship actually one of the key elements for their long-term sustainable development of their business. And they were not just for fun when prices were low and maybe a roaster paid a better price. They really stick to it and keep nurturing them. And for me, this shows that these two ends of the supply chain in the future will connect more, and that will also, and I think we will talk about this later also, that will certainly also redefine the role of traders in between, etc. in the future. That was one of the takeaways.
Yeah, thank you. Alyssa, what's your take on this?
Thank you, Peter. Yes, well, for me, I would say, a lot has been mentioned already from Nora and Raphael. So I felt maybe two major aspects kind of resonated with me a lot. The first one, kind of picking on what Raphael was saying about the direct relationship. If we look at more like local relationships, so it was interesting to see that cooperatives and cooperative representatives themselves were somehow caught in some complicated situations because of the high price of coffee. There were like a lot of individual producers that were normally selling to these associations that decided to potentially sell to others and try to get higher prices working with other players. So in that level, kind of that direct connection from the individual producers to the association was a bit less strong, I would say, compared to what we've seen between roasters and producers. And we saw that especially when interviewing, for example, two cooperatives. One was in Honduras and Costa Rica, so that was definitely something that came up a lot in Central America. But also something that added to the competition, the complexity that came up from the report was increased competition locally. So, for example, in Rwanda, we saw that one cooperative representative mentioned that internally in the country, there was higher competition. So potentially new exporting businesses coming up, competing with them. So of course, that also affected somehow the internal market and increased kind of the struggle when it came from individual associations that were trying to sell the coffee. And of course, in general, as Nora mentioned, a lot of the frictions that already we saw from increased cost of production, such, for example, inputs that Nora mentioned about fertilizers, and the complexity of signing contracts in a specific time, and really added to that kind of decreased profit that these associations were seeing in that case. And on the other level, if we're looking at roasters, also another point they came up quite intensively was from roasters to how to communicate these increasing prices to final consumers, because of course, that also played a huge role. And I would say that in terms of responses that we got, they were trying to go in two different ways. The first way was either revisiting a bit the product strategy. So either looking at specialty roaster, for example, going for new coffee origin. That is also something that we're going to mention later on the webinar more specifically, but also looking at like new products, like such as launching new ready-to-drink beverages as well. But also differentiating with new service. So trying to maybe include, I don't know, training opportunities for their customers in their business model, as well as merchandising as well. So this is kind of one stream in which they were trying to increase profitability to kind of leverage these differences that kind of affected, of course, the increase in prices. And on the other side, instead, we also saw that other specialty roasters replying to kind of our questions were saying, you know, for us instead is more like communicating this increase in prices more directly to our loyal customers. And we know that potentially some of these customers will probably kind of start, you know, buying coffee somewhere else, and that's okay. And we'll try to strengthen as much as possible the relationship that we have with our most loyal customers, and work from there and try to build on top of those loyal relationships. So that's kind of the two ways that we saw. And yeah, I think I will leave it here in terms of major takeaways. This has been an extremely interesting report to work on, and there's definitely many more insights that we're going to share later on. So thank you for that.
Great, thanks. I mean, I think that there are so many different influences on the coffee market historically that it's kind of hard to extrapolate what results and what impacts the pandemic itself in an isolated way had on the coffee market. So I'm wondering whether we can now sort of fast forward, because, you know, we're now nearly a year out from when this data was gathered. And I'm wondering if you have any insights about how these issues have sort of evolved since the report was published, and to what degree they're continuing to affect these various stakeholder groups. And I guess I want to start with you, Raphael, because I think it's one thing in mid-pandemic to be talking about direct trade relationships, but how have those endured now that we're, you know, at this stage of the pandemic, where we're still, you know, there's still lots of problems around logistics and pricing?
Yeah, I had some thoughts when I was listening to Nora and Elisa, because they were both mentioning a lot of profitability, and you know, I think that's very important for producers to understand. It's not just the FOB price that affects a roaster. There is often a currency exchange that is volatile as well. I mean, the euro lost a lot against dollars these last months. We have shipping rates that were for a long time fixed, because there were contracts a year out with shipping companies that suddenly increased. And we are getting to a point where it's not anymore where roasters realize I cannot sit it out. So it's not just that I will have a year of lower profitability. It's getting to the point where I believe it can affect the top line. And the top line means, you know, market share, means revenues, means growth. And, you know, that's not just because of the price of the input per se, but we have other issues that stroke as well. We have in Europe and the US shortage of labor. I'm traveling through the West Coast. In every coffee shop I see we are hiring. There is shortage of labor. We have the first time a reduction of Arabica consumption in Europe, they reported. We have, I see roasters ordering less from the same partners at origin, because they're saying, I just cannot compete with this price with that other coffee from another, maybe other origin. Consumers will switch. And I think there is, last but not least, especially in Europe, there is also a gas shortage that is expected, and that might even, put roasters out of business, just because they cannot produce anymore. And I think this is this is really getting to a different stage, and I think that's very important to note. That report was written when everybody was hoping and thinking and answering in a mindset of it's going to be over, and I think that going to be over just lasts longer, and new problems add to it, and that's certainly something to be taken into account for the next year's report.
Yeah, thank you so much. So now I'm going to ask you all to kind of aim your telescopes even a little bit higher at the horizon and look out a little bit further and talk about some of these long-term trends, because obviously even before the pandemic started to be an issue in our lives and all of the effects started to be calculated, the coffee industry was already grappling with any number of existing challenges, which, were linked to climate change, farmer livelihoods, value distribution, finance, traceability, transparency, all of those things. So I'm wondering, in your estimation, how did the pandemic interact with these issues, and has it led to any significant changes in how the industry approaches these challenges? Because I know on a personal level, many of us saw the pandemic as an opportunity to kind of hit the reset button. How did that happen in the industry?
Thanks, Peter. Yeah, I think I know Lisa will have a lot to say about this, so I'll just start for now by mentioning how we approached looking at the pandemic and the research itself. And I would say that we approached the research more looking at the pandemic more in the sense of the pandemic kind of framed, or wasn't necessarily the cause, but was the frame of the challenges that we were trying to understand. So we were trying to understand the challenges the industry was facing sort of post-pandemic, and whether or not they were caused or influenced by the pandemic. It was interesting to us, but that was sort of the frame that we looked at. We didn't necessarily look at how is the pandemic exacerbating every challenge, but rather just acknowledging that it did. And so that's kind of our frame, right? And it placed the industry in a position that it had to really navigate. And there were definitely some things that were unique about that, right? So in particular, some roasters, for example, talked about how it was really challenging to remain open if they had coffee shops during the pandemic, and so then to stay alive, for example, a lot of them had to switch to online sales. So the way we sort of kind of approached the research was to say, okay, how are you navigating those online sales, recognizing that the pandemic sort of caused that that shift, and I think it was a lot challenging for a lot of people to come away with just feeling like, okay, we've gotten out of this pandemic somewhat, right? We've sort of survived through the hardest time of it, and now the next thing is, okay, this is higher prices, and so we have to kind of figure out something else or another way to get through and kind of weather the storm. And so we didn't necessarily look at and whether or not, did the pandemic make people more resilient, and so they were more prepared for the changing prices and the changing landscape? I think anecdotally we can say probably, but we didn't do sort of specific research on increased levels of resilience. But I do think kind of thinking about that anecdotally is interesting. And the other thing that was, I think, critical for, as I mentioned before, trying to frame the research is we wanted to know which of these challenges post-pandemic we felt like were more here to stay. And I think one example of that is the online sales, as I mentioned, because it seems like they're going to stay. They're going to be a trend for the next while, which differs from prices, because I do think a lot of people were skeptical. A lot of the people we spoke to, whether they were producers, roasters, or other, were skeptical that prices would really remain high. They expected them to go back down. But conversely, once you create this new market and you're creating more online sales for the business, companies are going to want to continue that, and they're going to have conversations about how to grow that. So I would say right now, that's really where I think we are as roasters and producers as well, having more conversations about, okay, as a result of the pandemic and some of these sort of changes that it triggered, how do we meet these new market expectations or these new trends. Should we focus more on blends or single origins? And if people are buying online, what are they going to prefer? What's the sort of appetite for quality? And so, that's a lot of, I would say, what we looked at in the report, but also what I think we should be continuing in the conversation now. So I'll leave it there as an example and turn it over to Elisa as well.
Yeah, thanks. So just to stay on this point of pricing for a second, for so many years, the industry has been focused on increasing yields and improving quality. And now that we're seeing these elevated prices that look to be continuing for at least the next few months and into 2023, how has that impacted purchase strategies on the parts of roasters? Elisa, do you have a point of view on that?
Yes, thank you, Peter. Yeah, it's been interesting because also, I would say also something that Rafael mentioned very, very briefly, the logistics aspect. So definitely, so we're seeing a lot of complexity throughout, and definitely also the kind of challenges that came from the increasing prices and the timeline shifts with the logistics really also affected how roasters were kind of strategizing behind when to buy, what to buy, and exactly how to make sure that they had the coffee that they needed available for their customers. And I would say that, of course, this is something that we are seeing, like the disruption is something that we saw also when we were collecting findings last year, but it's also something that we're seeing right now continuing to affect the end market actors when it comes to really understanding, when the coffee will be available or when it will arrive, and of course also those intermediaries like Algrano being affected as well. In terms of actual strategy, I would say that there were like two trends that we saw. We saw some roasters kind of went overstock and others trying to differentiate as much as possible. So, for example, in the report, you will see that some of the roasters that we interviewed mentioned that, for example, their strategy was looking for like similar origins. So if the coffee was not available, for example, in Colombia, then they could potentially buy from Peru, and that could allow them to have a bit of stability in the kind of purchasing strategies that they were trying to follow. However, of course, there was also an interest to leverage those direct connections that Rafael was talking about. So this connection directly with producers, and it was also interesting to hear from an example from a roasters in the Netherlands that mentioned that for those producers that they were working with for longer time, that was easier. They were able to find like a win-win solutions to make sure that the coffee was purchased and delivered as much as possible on time. Instead, for like new providers, so new relationship, that was definitely more challenging. And finally, I would say we saw also when it came to quality that there is technically on overall level an interest for kind of improving the base quality of coffee in the lower end of the specialty coffee sector. But at the same time, it's also interesting to see how those findings differentiated. So when we asked the same questions to like interviews that respondents, what happened there was that a lot of them were saying that they wanted to actually potentially drop like very new flavors and potentially try to offer more like premium coffees instead of very, very high level coffees compared to what was happening beforehand, before the pandemic. And instead, when we're looking at the respondents from the survey, we saw a lot of people there that were saying, for us, we still want to experiment, we still want to offer our customers very special coffees that otherwise are very difficult to find in the market. So that was a bit conflicting. But it's also, I mean, we can say just as very last comment that, of course, I mean, we did select potentially like interviews responded. Instead, the survey was more open based, and of course, that's probably why the responses and findings on that level are conflicting. But that's definitely kind of the impact that we saw, and also in connection to trends that are happening right now.
Gosh, there's so much to dig into there, and I have to stop myself because I want to leave some time for Q&A, but there's other subjects that I want to dig into here, and quickly pivot to the issue of sustainability, something very near and dear to my work, and I'm sure as well to yours and many of the audience members. So since its beginning, sustainability has been kind of a pillar of the specialty coffee industry. But our definition of sustainability within the industry has kind of remained, well, I don't know, elusive or kind of ever expanding. And it started off, being concerned with environmental stewardship, and then now it's evolved into social justice, farmer livelihoods, gender equality, access to education, and more recently, carbon footprints. So I'm wondering, given this prospect of continuing high prices, how do you see the industry continuing to invest in these important initiatives? And also, what role do certifications play, especially given these higher prices? Anybody want to take a stab at that?
Yeah, I'll go ahead. It's also my favorite topic, so I'll try to keep it short for time's sake, Peter. But yeah, I mean, I think what's really interesting is I was, I guess, skeptical going into the conversation with roasters and producers about sustainability, and felt like maybe there would have been a different answer from the European market versus the U.S. market. Skeptical in the sense that I wasn't sure what the commitment, would be. But at least for the European market, I was really pleasantly surprised to see that the roasters, as well as producers that were selling to the European market, really wanted to double down on sustainability and make it even more of a priority. First, I mean, they talked about it as from the perspective of marketing, and how, similar to the need to make sure that they're selling quality, sourcing and selling quality coffee as a starting point. Both roasters and producers also acknowledge the need for coffee to be sustainable. Regardless of kind of the definition, but in some form, sustainable as a starting point, because this added to the concept of quality. And so in a way, this pointed to the need for differentiation, but it also, I think, differentiating by sustainability, but also just to the kind of relevance itself and the interest itself, which is definitely growing. And kind of beyond the marketing perspective, I think producers and roasters alike just simply understood that without a focus on sustainability, there might not be coffee in the future, or our coffee future will look very different, right? And so that mostly related to climate change, and to kind of whether and what extent the coffee landscape, will be affected or completely different, or production will decrease. And I know we're planning to talk about some production predictions soon, but I think this was the concern around production, and the concern around maybe the long-term impact of this, both on prices but livelihoods, really kept the point about sustainability front and center, for both roasters and producers that we spoke to. And then in terms of certifications, I think that was a different story. So based on what people said in the responses to the surveys, as well as in interviews, I think people were less interested in certifications as we sort of traditionally understand them. I think in the industry, often when you say certification, people, of course, think of things like Rainforest Alliance, organic certification, or fair trade. And while those certifications were not, it was not signaled to us that roasters, were interested in growing that aspect of their business as much as other types of differentiation. I think they really pointed to the interest in accountability and sustainability, sort of like proving their sustainability. That was of interest. And so in my mind, it's a little bit like certification of a different type. More and more companies are looking at B Corp, carbon neutrality. People mentioned wanting to do transparency reports as a way to differentiate themselves. And all of these things require audits, right? And they're kind of like a new wave of sustainability, or excuse me, a new wave of accountability and certification of kind of a different name in the industry. So while I think I question the growth of these traditional types of certifications, I do think this accountability and pressure to be accountable and to certify in some way is continuing to grow. So of course, if it goes the way of traditional certification, we're definitely going to see a lot of criticism of that. But the interest is definitely there, and it's something to keep looking at for sure. So I think I missed a few things I wanted to say, but I know we're out of time. So go ahead, Peter.
Yeah, no. Thanks for that. I have about 10 more questions for you that I'm going to try to roll into like 2. I think that the coffee industry has always sort of encountered a lot of uncertainty, whether it's price volatility, whether it's weather patterns. But now we're sort of seeing this perfect storm of economic uncertainty, environmental uncertainty, currency valuations, interest rates, depleted ICE certified stocks, the questions about Brazilian harvest numbers, all of those things. And I think one of the results of that is the lack of long-term contracts that are being offered. And I just wonder if somebody would just briefly for a minute touch on what that looks like in the next year, how that's going to affect the industry.
Yeah, I totally see, or I totally share your view, Peter. There is less interest on both ends to enter long-term contracts. On one hand, planning got very hard for roasters. That's one thing. Sometimes they don't know when the coffee will arrive, so how should they plan the next purchase? That's one thing. The other thing is growers with the volatility in prices. Cooperatives were mentioned several times. It's very hard for them to agree to a price today. And then when they actually have to source the coffee from their members, prices are totally different, and they have troubles fulfilling the contracts. And so on one hand, it's very integral to say no today, and to say I cannot commit to that, rather than commit and then actually fail on executing or fail on delivering it. That's one thing that I think I prefer, the openness there, the discussion there. But on the other hand, it's also, there is also something has happened on the market. If you look at forward pricing curve, we're in a backwardation. So coffee today is more expensive than in a few months. And I think that also adds to it. There's a different perception in the origin countries than in the consuming countries. And I think that is, for me, typical in crisis, so crisis get very, or how should I say that, it's getting very personal. We at the end we're doing business, but we are humans, and we interpret the crisis best to our business and how it suits our interpretation and or our view of the market. And I think there is currently a lack of, in my mind, communication. And I think that's also where I really try to encourage roasters, and I hope growers were also in the audience today, where we really have to talk to each other and explain what the drivers are, why we do not believe that the prices are the right prices today, why we are waiting with purchasing as a roaster because we believe markets drop, and why growers are not happy to contract on a lower price in March than the price today because they don't believe in it. And I think I always use that the Chinese, they write the word crisis with 2 brush strokes, right? One is danger and one is opportunity, and it means opportunity. And I think there was a famous American politician citing these ones, and I think the opportunity is there. We need to share more. We need to discuss more together and outline the realities of the buying market and outline the realities of the producing markets to to understand. And I'm pretty sure, because we have an eagerness to have more direct relationships. We have an eagerness to build long-term partnerships. That's what we found. Remember, 2/3 of both ends want to have it. So I think that's the good starting point. But now it's really about talking to each other and listening to each other to find there an agreement. And I'm sure then long-term contracts can bring stability back, because none of us, and I think that's also the opportunity of today. We are in such high volatilities on both ends of the chain. Usually it's only just one that has a trouble to solve. But now we have on both ends problems. And that brings us in a unique situation that we should actually understand. Both of us don't like the volatility. Let's find an agreement. Let's discuss and listen to bring back stability to our businesses.
Thank you so much. Yeah, I think that you make a really good point about talking and listening to one another, and that's why I think forums like this are so important. There's a whole nother subject area that I wanted to dive into that unfortunately we're not going to be able to, and that is the role of data and transparency and traceability. And there's been so much discussion in our industry around that. But it's too big of a onion to start peeling back on right now. So in lieu of that, I would like to, before we move into the Q&A session, ask each of you, in your estimation, very briefly, and you're going to have to drill it down into one, just pick one topic. If you could share with us what you feel the most important takeaway from the report is, and what you feel everyone in the industry should be focusing on. Nora?
Thanks, Peter. I mean, I think it's piggybacking on what Raphael said, that the work really pointed out to me that relationships and communication as a tool to seek equity, or as what that could look like, seemed to be the sort of driving point of the work for me. That seemed to be the only way that we were going to weather this storm together in kind of an equitable way, is through relationships and conversation. So I think how we do that's a challenge, but that's my takeaway for now.
Elisa.
Yes. So very briefly, you mentioned data. I know we don't have the time to fully deep dive into it, but very quickly, I do think that access of information is very important, and that comes also from making data available, on both ends. We saw with the Algrano report that is definitely like a starting point to make an effort for producers to have more information about, how the market is going. I really hope that we can see that more in the sector, since we know that the information is there, and mostly and market actors have it. So we have to better understand as an industry how we can make sure that the information goes both ways, for sure.
Yeah, exactly to this point, what you're saying, Elisa. I think for me it's important that in consuming countries, roasters understand that on the other hand, there is well-educated, well-developed growers that are eager to learn, eager to understand, and eager to share also. And I think we should not hide anymore and really reach out and talk and share information. That will only make the chain I think economically sustainable in the future.
Thank you so much. I want to dig into a couple of the questions that audience members have posted. And the first one, I think, should be fairly easy to answer. And that comes from Kathy. Will there be more of these reports? And if yes, how frequently might they be released?
I guess that's for me.
Yes.
That was the second one. We do it once a year. Usually it's in spring, I think March, April, May, around then that they are released. And certainly there is the plan to do the same next year again. Yeah, I think next year is a bit later because there's first an impact report to be published. But then I think Q2 next year, there should be the next one.
Okay, and then following up, there's another question from Teddy, whether there's any plan to expand the focus of these reports beyond just the EU.
Yeah, as well, we so far we did this because our main audience was European, but Algrano is launching also in the platform in the US, and we will integrate the US in the future there.
Fantastic. Okay, now here's a little bit more of a thornier question to dig into from Marvin, and it's on certifications, and it's really basically about what your views are on the future of certification schemes in light of the emerging regulation that's coming out of the EU around so many of the issues that certifications have dealt with: deforestation, child labor, living income, things like that. Who wants to take a stab at that?
I can try to take a stab at that. It's a really big question, and happy to take it offline with Marvin who asked. But I mean, in my perspective, I think that the certifying bodies are trying to find the answer to that themselves. How to remain relevant, how to be able to comply with a lot of these changing regulations, and then of course that impacts then what producers have to respond to and how they have to comply. So I think that's one thing if we're just talking about the certifying organizations themselves. But even so, some of the laws, especially in the EU, regardless of whether you are certified, you still have to comply with certain regulations, especially if you're of a certain size, right? So this is why I think the conversation is not just about certification, but it's about just like broader accountability and meeting these regulations in general. And I think it's really important for people to also think about what is the sort of roaster side of this, as well as what is the producer side, because producers, some in these interviews still did talk about really the relevance and their interest in continuing with certifications like fair trade. And so, there's not always an agreement on like what is the best way forward. And yeah, I just would ask, not that if anyone here, works for these, the government making these regulations, I do think some of them look good on the surface and they are really, really challenging for coffee actors to meet. And so I think this kind of just goes to Elise's point of sharing conversation and information, and really making sure that our regulations are not sort of onerous. Also going forward is going to be a key thing to look at. So, I could go on, but I'll turn it back for another question.
Yeah, I mean, from my perspective as the former global coffee manager for Fair Trade International, I could do a hour-long webinar on this question alone, but unfortunately we don't have the time for that. There's one more question also from Marvin, and it's whether the panel has any views on the impact of inflation on coffee purchases and how roasters and traders are going to try and cope with that. And I'd like to roll in also currency valuations, because there was just news, I think yesterday, that the US is considering increasing its borrowing rate by another 75 points. So anybody have a view on that?
I mean, as a seller to consumers, roasters are part of the consumption basket and are part of the inflation. So are part of creating inflation. And we are, we have to, or roasters have to, because all of what we mentioned before, of all the input costs that change, whether it's gas, whether it's labor costs, whether it's the green coffee or the shipping rates, and that's not something we can avoid, or that the industry can avoid, because that's a macroeconomic trend and not an industry trend, right? And what the US is doing is trying to counterbalance or let's say slow down the inflation with interest rate increases. We see the same in Switzerland. We see the same in Europe. So that's the macroeconomic cycle that we are entering. That is that is changing, and that's not, I think, how we cope with that is not different than a baker, than a machine engineer who has to buy steel, etc. It's just there, and we need to cover our costs, and we are giving those costs further into the consumers, and that's the only thing we can do, and we cannot stop it, or we cannot.
Yeah, thanks so much for that. Obviously, there's so many topics that we could spend so much more time on, and some that we didn't even get to. But unfortunately, our time is up, and I know from my point of view, I was really happy to participate in this. I learned a lot from all of you, and I'm sure that the participants likewise learned a lot, and there were a lot of takeaways for this. I would like to thank each of you for participating in this, and especially for the work of putting together that really important report. I think it was really useful, especially in this time of so much uncertainty, and I look forward to the other upcoming reports. I'd also like to thank everybody at the SCA for hosting this forum. I think it was really important, and I hope that it's a regular feature of SCA webinars or in-person meetings. So with that, I'll bring it back to you, Jen, if you have any closing remarks.
Oh, well, thank you so much for that, Peter. And I do want to echo the same sort of thank you to the team, because I always appreciate the availability of reports like this Algrano Market Trends review. I know it's, how much work goes into them, but just the fact that they exist and that they're an available free resource, that there's this effort to correct information asymmetry is just such a wonderful thing. So I also want to echo that thanks. But it's also just so great to hear it discussed in this context with you all. So that's really, really special. So first, thank you to Nora, Elisa, and Raphael for your insights. And also, Peter, thank you so much for moderating this discussion. And I know that it's really hard to get through all of these things, but I feel like we got a really good overview of everything. And I'm sure that I don't know, maybe I'm speaking out of turn, but that you all would be excited to talk about this in a different sort of forum if anybody had questions, because it is a truly, really exciting and sort of interesting report with lots of insights there. So big thanks. Okay, this is the bit I always get nervous, right? Transitions. So as I said at the start of the session, it would not be possible for us to do this event or make all of this knowledge freely available without our sponsors. So we're going to spend a minute learning about BWT Water and More, one of this year's supporting sponsors, and then it will be time for our third session, which asks, are coffee sector programs actually improving incomes for smallholder farmers? I will leave it to another Peter, my colleague Peter Giuliano, Chief Research Officer of the Specialty Coffee Association and Executive Director of the Coffee Science Foundation, to tell us more when we come back. But thank you all again for joining us in this session.